How's it going, Eliminators? Today we're going to be finishing up the video series on the 4x4 snowblower, so let's get right into it. So we're back in the shop and we're ready to finish up the series on this 4x4 snowblower here. So if you guys remember, we did break the sprocket from the right side of the unit, and not only did the top piece snap off, but it also cracked the sprocket right through. So we ended up getting a B-style sprocket, which essentially is just a sprocket with a hub on one side, but the hub was too large on one side and it didn't have anything on the left side, and we needed a C-style sprocket like this. So we sent this sprocket out to get machined. You guys can see that our machinist took down the face of where the hub was on this side, and we purchased a hub separately, and we ended up getting him to machine down a little piece, and the keyways were the same. So now, fit together, we essentially have a C-style sprocket. And I do have a little shaft here. This is just a 3/4 inch shaft with a key put into it so that it holds everything together nicely. What I'm going to do is most likely put this into my vise over here, and I'm going to lay in a little bit of weld to weld the hub onto this sprocket here. Now, I'm not sure if I really have to lay in some thick weld, because basically what holds the sprocket centered where the key is essentially just those thrust washers inside of the housing when they're bolted together. So it's kind of just like a press fit, but I think for the time that it'll take me, I'm just going to go in and lay a couple stitch welds in here just to make sure that nothing comes off and everything's nice and strong. So using a pair of locking pliers here, I've just gone ahead and clamped it together so that the hub is nice and flat. Now, the important thing is going to be not to get any weld splatter on the teeth of the sprocket here. So I actually bought something to prevent that from happening. So I went out and bought some anti-splatter. The company that makes this is Cantesco, and essentially what this does is you basically spray it on wherever you don't want weld to stick. So what I'm probably going to do is spray some into a bottle cap, and then I'm just going to brush it onto the teeth. Now, it might be difficult to pick up on the camera, but I went ahead and applied some to a Q-tip, and then I went around, and you might be able to see where the metal is lighter on the inside and darker on the outside. So I've essentially just wiped down the teeth of the sprocket with the anti-splatter, and I'll go ahead and lay in a small little stitch weld on either side. And to weld this, I'm going to be using my Lincoln Electric Weld Pack 155 with a bottle of gas on it to control the porosity. So using a scrap lawnmower blade here, I just went ahead and did a couple test passes, and you guys can see that I've just started to dial in my heat and my wire feed. I'm not really trying to put in a lot of material. I'm more or less just trying to fuse the two metals together. So I'm running my weld pack here on D with about 4 1/4 on my wire feed setting. So this is the state of the welds. Started by doing stitches. By the time I got here, the weld started to pool away from me because I'm laying this flat, so gravity wants to pull the weld down. And I ended up getting a little splatter on the inside of the tooth here. So I ended up taking my Dremel to clean that up. And before I make it any worse, I've just decided to go in and lay some small tacks. So on the last pass, you saw me do 3 little tacks, letting them cool in between. We really don't need a lot of weld, because if you think about it, the key is holding the sprocket itself onto the shaft, and the hub is basically only serving a purpose to center the sprocket. So welding this sprocket isn't really a necessity, but just something extra that I wanted to do. I think doing the tacks is a better idea. Now, if I would have put my sprocket on a 45, the welds would have sank in a little bit better, but it didn't have to be fully welded, so I'm not too worried about that. And the best part of this is the shaft slides right out. So that's just my little test shaft that I have with the key in it. Again, that was just to kind of hold things in place. And the sprocket is now welded up. Okay, so I'm over here on the left side of the machine. I went ahead and slid on the backing plate here. Then I have a washer. I've set my little keyway in there, so now the sprocket is locked onto the shaft. So next up, I'm going to slide on another washer, and then I'll go ahead and start getting the axles installed on the outside there. There's also washers on either side of these axles here. These are for the wheels, and I've already got that one in. I'm going to put this one in, and then I'll go ahead and start wrapping the chain around just to get it loosely installed. So things are starting to come together now. I have the chain looped around, but we're going to have to hook up the idler. Now, if you'll remember from, I believe it was part 1, on the left side, the chain comes from the front here up around the top sprocket, and then it loops back down around the idler and then comes back up to the sprocket. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my chain and take all the slack out of it so it's over here, and then I'll go ahead and put my bolt through with my new pulley that I have from Oregon. So it should look a little something like this. I have my pulley installed, the bolt going through the back plate with the spacer on the pulley facing the inside of the machine, and then there's a washer on the outer side. So having the nut on the outside just allows you to put the plate on and then line up that bolt. Now before I go ahead and put the plate onto the machine, you want to make sure that you have all 3 of your thrust washers on each axle, and I've also gone ahead and applied quite a bit of nickel anti-seize to all of the axles. And at this point, if you wanted to lubricate your chain and your sprockets, you could go ahead and do so, but you really don't have to worry about that because there are 4 grease fittings on either side of this machine just for these chain boxes. So the first one is going to be on the outside of your center main axle. You're going to be pumping grease into that, and it's going to lubricate not only your bushings, but all that grease is going to squeeze out to the chain there as well. Then there's going to be 2 individual grease fittings on the insides of these separate axles, so you guys can see it's just a grease fitting and they run through the holes to lubricate the bushings and the sprockets. So you're going to be getting grease on the front and the rear sprocket, the center sprocket, and then there's also a grease fitting that lubricates the pulley, and that's on the inside of the backing plate there. So I have the backing plate for the other side, and you guys can see it's right down there, and that hole there is for the idler pulley bolt. So all of this is going to be completely greased, but I'm going to go ahead and spray some lube onto that chain just to ensure that it's nice and lubricated. I ended up choosing some white lithium. This stuff will stay soft at a lower temperature. You guys can see I heavily applied it to the chain and all the sprockets. So I'm now ready to go ahead and install my outer panel. Now, depending on how clean your axle shafts are, you may have a hard time getting the outer plate on. So you may want to use a little rubber mallet to help move that plate in a little easier. So I've now managed to get the plates pushed together. If you're wondering how the plate system here prevents itself from just pulling off of the machine because there's no pin or nut or bolt at the end here to hold it in place, the answer is that it's just simply held on by the key. So on the main center axle shaft is what's known as a Woodruff key. So that's the key that has the rounded bottom to it. That's one of these guys right here, and that's what a Woodruff key looks like. So it just has a rounded bottom to it, and this is what the center sprocket grabs onto. The thrust washers that are on this axle shaft and the bushings can't go past it either this way or that way. So there is a little tiny bit of play in there. The play is pretty much limited to what it would have been from the factory. So I've gone ahead and installed the 8 3/8 bolts all around the outside, and I've tightened them up. And just to show you guys that there is still going to be a little bit of play, this is how much play is still in the axle, and that's the side-to-side play. Now the reason for that is because if you look at the thickness of the Woodruff key and the thickness of the sprocket is actually wider than the key. So that sprocket is going to move on the key, and then the thrust washers on the outside of the sprocket are what's stopping that. So if MTD would have ran a slightly longer key, this play would have been less. And it doesn't matter how many thrust washers I put in there, there's still going to be that play between the key and the sprocket itself. So the left side is now completely reassembled. I'm going to be leaving the wheels and tires off for now just until I go ahead and get the right side back together. So I'm going to come over to the right side here, repeat the same steps that I did on the left side. The only thing that's going to be different is how the chain is routed, and I'm going to bring you guys back when I'm at that stage just to kind of speed things up here. So for the process of installation, pretty much everything's going to be identical. The only thing that's different is, if you guys will remember, on the other side, towards the front of the machine, we wrapped the chain around the front of the idler pulley. On this side, we're going to be running the chain on the back side, and this is facing the back. And basically what that does is it's going to give you an even pull forwards and backwards. You're generally going to be running this machine in forward gear, which means that this sprocket here is going to be turning clockwise, and it's going to be pulling against this chain here. So as you could imagine, if they ran both chains this way, then when you go to run it in reverse, you're going to get a lot of pull on your idler pulley. So what they do is they kind of flip-flop. They run one side one way and the other side the other way. So you're going to get a lot of pull on your sprocket in forward from your right side, and you're going to get a lot of pull from your sprocket in reverse on the left side. Now, we were missing 3 washers. We weren't necessarily missing them all on the same side. I think there was 2 from this side and 1 from that side. I ended up using all of the old thrust washers on that side. So I have my 3 brand new thrust washers here, and they're going to be going on the outsides of these axles here. With that being said though, I'm going to go ahead and install my idler pulley, get this side wrapped up. So the right side is going to look a little something like that. And if you're wondering how these Oregon pulleys match up compared to the OEM ones, you're going to notice that they're not as wide. However, the chain fits perfectly inside of that idler pulley. Oregon says it's a direct replacement. The chain goes deep enough into the groove there, and like I said, that groove is wide enough to fit the chain perfectly. So everything should be good. There shouldn't be any grinding noise or any issues with the idler pulley. But I'm glad I went ahead and replaced them because if you'll remember here, the OEM ones were really beat up. That's years of abuse right there. So I didn't want to reuse these. Like you can see, they're a little bit wider. But even on the OEM one, you guys can see that because of all the wobble, that chain probably started to get off track a little bit and just completely destroyed the side of this idler pulley. So now that the bushings are all replaced, there's going to be less wobble to this whole system here. And now that we have all of the thrust washers in place, there should be less side to side or end play. So everything should be quite secure and hold itself together. And before I go ahead and bolt up the right side chain box, I've gone ahead and sprayed white lithium grease, just like I did with the left side, to lubricate the chain and the sprockets. That'll give it a nice preemptive lubrication before I go ahead and hit all of the grease fittings with low temperature grease from my grease gun. I've got the wheels installed on the left side and things are looking pretty good, guys. So I'm quite happy with how this is turning out, because if you'll remember in part 1, when I lifted up the back end of this machine, the whole left side wheel assembly, this was the one that was the most loose, tilted in from how much wear it had on those bushings. So I'm quite happy with how this turned out. Everything's looking nice and square. The right side here is completely put back together. Everything's looking good. So I'm going to go ahead and get the wheels installed. And there we have it, guys. The 4x4 snowblower is finally put back together. And if I lift up the back end here, let's see how much play there is. Hardly any on the right side. And hardly any on the left side. So things are looking pretty good. Looks like we've solved the issue of our wobble. So I'm going to check the plug, probably check the oil as well, because I flipped it up a couple times. I'll put some fresh fuel into it. I'll take it outside, fire it up, let it run for a bit, make sure everything's good, and then I'll bring you back when I'm ready to throw some snow with it.
Well, believe it or not, this thing fired up first pull, runs pretty good, but the fuel that was in the tank had K100S fuel stabilizer in it. Got the skidders, or the shoes, adjusted so that it's just off of the concrete. It's cleaning it up pretty good. What I'm going to do next is go up and pull the drive release and see how this thing turns.
think I found the new nickname for this 4x4 snowblower, and that's the Beast, because this thing really is a beast. It just keeps going. It keeps pushing forward no matter what's in front of you. I know that we don't have a lot of snow here, but this has been coming down and it's quite densely packed, so this isn't like light powder that we're throwing here, because the humidity here is crazy. It's very humid, very wet snow, very heavy, and this unit has the double auger belt, so a lot more friction up front there to throw the snow. And I know that I mentioned in an earlier video in this series that I had a customer that was interested in buying this for maybe $450, but I gotta be honest, even if I could sell this thing for $500, I'm not too sure I'd want to. This machine is honestly so much fun to use, and because of the drive system that it has, it's a little bit heavier, a little bit harder to control when you're moving it around in tight spaces, but all of that's worth it to me. And the hand warmers even work. They have a switch up here. You just flip this on, and when the engine's running, it heats your hands up. For a machine that's as old as this, which it's not that old, that was probably a new feature on one of these snowblowers here. And you may have noticed that it also has a toggle switch here for the chute control, left or right, but the previous owner must have removed it and just installed a normal hand crank, which I actually prefer. Much better, less hassle. You set your chute wherever you want it to go. The tilt up top works as well. Not sure if you guys can make that out or not, but I'd say that's about a good 15 feet right there.
Well, that's it for today's video. That also wraps up our 4-part series on the 4x4 snowblower. We were able to replace all of the drive bushings for not only the main axles, but also the lower drive axle as well. We replaced the friction wheel, and we were able to find a replacement sprocket for the one that cracked when we tried to remove it. We ended up welding a hub onto that to transform it from a B-style sprocket into a C-style centered sprocket. We replaced any missing thrust washers where we needed to, and we also installed 2 new idler pulleys so everything would run nice and smoothly. With everything lubricated and put back together, this thing ran flawlessly. It fired right up on the second pull after not running for almost a year, and the machine ran strong. It kept pushing, it didn't stop driving, and it throws the snow quite far. Even though there wasn't a whole lot of snow, it is pretty heavy and dense snow, but this thing didn't stop for anything. So if you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week, check channel out for new content, and as always guys, thanks for watching.